Hi everybody, welcome back to the Menschik Club. This is hopefully what is going to be the first of a series of uh, beginners topics that I'm going to be covering. Um, Many of my other videos are a little bit more advanced. So these videos are going to be for folks who maybe know how to move the pieces already, but want to just learn some basic chess strategies. And so I'm going to start out with a really, really important topic, which is how to checkmate your opponent if you are up a queen and they just have their king left. Um, this is something that I've seen a lot of beginners struggle with if they don't know the technique. Um, Obviously, they're pretty sure that they're winning because they have an extra queen, but they're just not quite sure how to force checkmate on their opponent. And I have seen people fail to win these positions. Maybe they stalemate their opponent, meaning it's a draw, or they just can never, they never can just get past aimlessly sort of chasing the king around the board with checks. So there is a technique to this. It's fairly easy once you know it, um, but for most people, they have to be shown. So we're going to get started then with this position here. Um, and the first thing I want to point out is that the weaker side's king is against the edge of the board. It has to be this way. You have to either be on the edge or in the corner um, in order to deliver the checkmate. Or rather, the weaker side's king has to be on the edge or in the corner. So in any given position where you're a queen up, that's the first task you have, is to drive the opponent's king into the corner or onto the edge. Otherwise, it'll have too many escape squares and you'll never be able to deliver mate. So in this position, I want you to just pause your video and see if you can find the two possible moves that deliver checkmate to the black king. So I'm going to go ahead and show you these two moves. The first is queen moves to c7. So queen to c7 is a checkmate. This checkmating pattern with the queen directly facing the king and protected by white's king is called the kiss of death by some teachers. I kind of like that. I think it's very evocative. So anyway, you'll notice that the white queen is checking the black king, threatening to capture it on the next move. As we know, you have to move out of check or try to remove the check somehow, either by capturing the checking piece or interposing something. Clearly, we can't interpose anything because black doesn't have any other pieces. Also, there's no squares between the queen and king. So, black could try or could think about moving the king here or here, but unfortunately for him, white's queen controls both of those squares. So those would still be check. That's no good. The black king could think about trying to capture white's queen, but her king is protecting the queen, and so that is also impossible. You can't have kings on adjacent squares next to each other because they'd both be in check at the same time, and the rules of chess say you can't do that. So basically, you can't do any of those three things, and you also, for the same reasons, can't move here or here. Both of white's pieces control those two squares as well. So that is checkmate. So let's go back. What's the other checkmate? Well, the other checkmate is a little bit of a different pattern, but it's equally effective. It's queen to h8, checking the king at a distance. And the reason why this is checkmate, even though the queen is farther away, is because white's king helps out covering all three possible escape squares. And you'll notice that Neither one of these squares is open to the black king either, because the queen's influence extends all the way. I don't know that there's necessarily a name for this out there, but I would call it maybe like being trapped in the hallway. So that is, those are the two possible mating patterns. There are variations of this that you might see, but everything basically boils down to these two possibilities. Either you have a hallway mate like this, or you have the kiss of death. And notice this can happen if the black king was in the corner as well. It would work just as well. Okay. Here is another example of just what I just mentioned. In this position, the kings aren't quite so close together. They're not directly facing one another horizontally or vertically, but they are at a diagonal. And so in this position, with black to move, black can actually play queen to g2. Or actually, it's queen to b7. So moving the queen to this square. It delivers a check. The king protects the queen. And both of those squares are also covered by the queen. So this is how you deliver a checkmate once you've got the king against the edge of the board and you've activated your king so that it's close by and can help the queen. But how do we actually get our opponent into this position in the first place? We assume they're not going to just cooperate and just walk over there where they can get checkmated. So we have to actually force them to do this. And that is, there's a technique that is sometimes called shrinking the box. And I think that's a very good way of describing it and conceiving of it. So we're going to look at that next. So here is a position. White is to move. And you'll see that the queen and king are sort of offside. You know, the king is in the corner, the white king, that is. The white queen is huddled next to it, and the black king is seemingly has all the freedom to walk around in the world. It's over in the center of the board. So this is a position where we must take things into our control, and we must drive black's king into a worse position and get our own king active. And how we do that is creating a smaller and smaller box in which the black king can operate. So how do we do this? And by the way, there's not one way to do this. In any given position, there's going to be many, many different ways. The way that I show you now may not even be the shortest possible way. There may be ways that are more efficient than this. But this is just to show you how to get the job done. So the first move that I would suggest maybe is queen to d2. Why queen to d2? Well, because first of all, the white queen controls this file and controls this rank. Therefore, the black king is in a box. It's a box described by that file, that rank, and the two edges of the board here along the H file and along the 8th rank. Also, you'll notice that the white queen, because she can move on the diagonal too, denies the black king those squares. So what we're going to try to do here is just make the black king live in a smaller and smaller box. So black is not going to basically do everything we want. So they're going to try to stay centralized and go king to f5. There are other moves too that the black king could consider, and we just operate similarly to what we're going to see. So I'm going to suggest the move queen to e3. And you'll notice something here, that the white queen is moving so that it's at a knight's distance away from the black king. Notice also that we're not checking. If we check in this ending, it has to be for a really good reason. Like if we're going to drive the king to the edge by checking, that might be a good reason. But normally we're going to not check. We're just going to use this knight's distance method and shrink that box slowly but surely. So black is not going to cooperate again. They're going to go king to g4. We're still a knight's distance away, but we can actually shrink the box further with this move, queen to e5. So now you'll notice we're in a much smaller box. The black king is in this tiny space now. Right now it can only go to h4 or h3, one of these two squares, or to f3. So we're seeing how quickly the white queen can limit what the black king can do. It's a very powerful piece, and the king is on its own is a fairly weak piece. So it doesn't take long to make this shrinking box phenomenon happen. So we're going to go king to f3 as black, because we don't want to just cooperate and go to the edge of the board right away. Now we could go queen to, queen to d4. Sorry about that. So we continue making the black king go closer and closer towards the edge. Notice that now there's only 3 files, or 3 ranks that it can operate in. So we're driving it closer to the edge of the board. And after king to e2, we can go queen to c3. Now there's only 2 ranks, the first and second rank, that the king can operate on. So we're getting closer to what it is that we want. King to d1. I want to point out that black's king could also go to f2. And then what we do is we just approach on the files, and it gets closer and closer towards h2, and then it finally has to go to h1. But we're going to assume for now that it goes to d1. And we can now go queen to b2. We've driven the king now to the edge. Now we just want to drive it towards the corner. King to f1, sorry, not to g1. So queen to c2, king to f1, queen to d2, king to g1, queen to e2, king to h1. So now the king is in the corner. There's something you're going to notice here, and that is that because the queen is cutting off this rank, and it also cuts off this square, now the king is forced to operate in these 2 squares only. This is actually the position that we want to achieve before we start bringing up our king. And again, this is not the only way you can achieve this. You can also bring your king in sooner. There is no one right way to do this. But this is a technique that you can follow that's fairly simple, easy to learn, and is very effective. Why do we want the king in only 2 squares? Well, there's a really easy way to blunder here, and I've seen a lot of beginning players do this. They're following their knight's distance technique and shrinking the box technique, and they're not thinking. When you get the king in the corner, you do want it to have 2 squares, not just 1. Because if you were to shrink the king down to only the h1 square, you've now thrown the win away, because this is now a stalemate. What's a stalemate? Well, it's when the king is not in check, but it doesn't have any legal moves, and you don't have any other legal moves you could make, like with another piece. So black has no legal moves, but isn't being attacked, and so that makes the position a draw. That means that basically white has done all this work for nothing and hasn't been able to win the game. So just to go back, I'll get rid of that green arrow. You want to leave the king so that it can move back and forth from G1 to H1, but not do anything else. And now what we're going to do is we're going to walk white's king all the way over and deliver checkmate. And we know from the last diagram we looked at that we really only have to walk the king as far over as, say, F1 or F3, and we're going to be able to mate with the queen on G2. So let's see how that happens. It's fairly simple because, again, black doesn't have any real moves or any ideas to try to get out. They can only shuffle their king back and forth. And now we just give the kiss of death. So that was fairly easy. I would encourage you to play over this. I would encourage you to try different moves for black. And I would also encourage you, if you can, to maybe practice this with the computer. If you have a computer where you can set up positions, or there's actually a function on Lichess where you can create an analysis board. And maybe I'll do another video about that. But you can actually practice these things with a computer or against a friend and have them just try to have them play the weaker side and then switch. Maybe if you're learning in a pair, you can have that you can switch sides where you trade having the queen. So those are good ways to practice this technique. So let's look at another example. Here you see it's also a position where the king, the black king, is fairly near the center. And so we have to do some work in order to drive it to the edge. One way you could start is with Queen E1. So now you've confined the black king to these 3 files only. So black may want to try moving closer to your queen, but then we do this. And literally in 2 moves, this is how powerful the queen is. In 2 moves, you've driven a fairly well centralized king into a tiny, tiny, tiny space of basically 3 squares by 4 squares. And you haven't even given them this diagonal. So if king to G4, we can actually, this is just to demonstrate that we can actually bring our king in sooner if we choose. We've already done the hard work of driving the king into a small space, so we can actually play around with bringing our king up sooner, but you'll notice we still maintain that knight's distance. And now the box shrinks again. And now we can actually use our own king in the process of driving the king closer to the edge of the board. You can drive the king to the edge with just your queen. I would encourage you to master that. But it also doesn't ever hurt to just bring your king in closer as well. So you'll notice how in the last few moves we've driven him to 1 single file, which is the H file. So king H3. And now we're just going to do the same thing we did before, which is we're going to make it so that the king has 2 squares in which to shuttle back and forth, but no more. So we just inch closer with our queen. And now, again, this is a place where you could easily go wrong and throw the game away. Don't move queen to G3, because that, again, is a stalemate. So remember, once the king is driven into the corner, you want to stay at just enough distance that it can actually give the king 2 squares in which to shuttle back and forth And meanwhile, our king can come up and assist in delivering a checkmate. So instead of queen to g3, we play the move. Actually, let's go back to this position. We don't play queen g3, we play king e2. King h2. Closer. And now checkmate is inevitable. After king h1, we actually have 5 different ways to checkmate the black king. Can you find all of them? I'm going to let you pause and see if you can find all 5. So if you want to pause the video, do it now. Okay, so the 5 different checkmates are, we have 3 different hallway checkmates. One is queen h5. That's when you go as far back as possible. Queen h4 and queen h3. All of these are the same basic checkmate. It's just the queen is sitting on a different square. And essentially you're checking from a distance, and the king is assisting by keeping the king, the black king that is, from getting out. Okay. We also have 2 kiss of death checkmates. One is queen to g2, and the other is queen to g1. So I want to back up a little bit and just hammer home the stalemate theme, because I think the biggest danger, aside from just not knowing how to actually construct a checkmate, the biggest danger for beginners, or even in some cases stronger players, may fall into this type of thing. The biggest danger is that you will allow a stalemate and allow your opponent to escape. So let me show you some typical stalemates that happen a lot. In this position, black is to move, and black could think to themselves, oh, you know, let me put my queen a knight's distance away from white's king, and blunder and go here. And this is actually a stalemate, because you'll notice that the queen, because she's so powerful, she cuts off those 2 squares, she cuts off this square, she cuts off this square, and black's king cuts off this square. Well, unfortunately, that's all 5 squares that the white king has at their disposal to move to. And you'll notice that the white king is not in check. So that is a stalemate. This is a very common stalemate pattern in this ending, so memorize this. Try to construct other types of stalemates that fall into this pattern, and just be aware of it. Always, always, once you've driven the king to the edge and you're slowly moving towards mate, you want to make sure that you're leaving the king at least 1 free square to move to until you're ready to deliver mate. Here is the stalemate we've already seen an example of. In this position, the first thing you notice is that black's king has only 2 squares. That's our signal that we need to start moving the king up so that it can assist the queen. We'd like, ideally, to get the king to one of these 2 squares. And since this is the closer, I'd say we move the king to f6. So we would just travel up this way, and then you can arrive at f6 in 3 more moves, and then deliver your checkmate on g7. But what's the wrong move? Well, the wrong move is queen to f7. That is a stalemate. We're seeing it in a different corner this time than we saw it last time, but this is the same stalemate. You're using the knight's distance technique, but you've overused it, because in a corner, a knight's distance will stalemate the opposing king. Here is a third example of what can happen. Let's say that you're black in this position, and you think to yourself, well, I want to get the king closer to assist with the mate. And let's say that you move your king to f6. You have now created a stalemate. Let's check and make sure that this is correct. The king closes off that square. The queen closes off these squares, and there are no other squares for the king to move to. So this is another way that potentially you could stalemate your opponent by mistake. And the same stalemate would result if you went here. And the same stalemate would result if you went here. Because from both of those squares, you still cover e7, which was the only square that white had. What would have been the correct way to go? One way that you could actually play this position is just as black to go here. You notice you still have left your opponent that square. So now we can just back our king up like this. That gives the white king this square. But you notice if they move there, we give them the kiss of death. Or we do a hallway checkmate. And notice there's two other of those as well. I could either move to either of those two squares too. And it's the hallway mate. So if let's say white doesn't want to cooperate by moving to f8, they can also move to d8. Notice we do not go here. That is another stalemate. And you can, on your own, you can verify that that is a stalemate. But it is. Take my word for it. So after king to d8, we would probably go here. You notice that still, white still has that e8 square, but doesn't have any of these or this. So now when the king moves to the e8 square, we again have three possible hallway mates, and we have a kiss of death. It's nice to have options. Here's another possible stalemate with white to move. This is a case where we might actually want to check the black king in order to drive it closer to the edge. So this would actually be a good move here, because after here we would go here, and we might actually then deliver a checkmate next move. But if we back up, we might be tempted to say, oh, let me put my queen a knight's move away from the king and do something like queen to b1. That's a stalemate. Or queen to c2. That's also a stalemate. So we always have to be very, very careful. So as an exercise, I'm going to give you this position. Find all the mates in one for black. And pause your video. All right, I'm going to now give the solutions. So there are 4 possible mates here, and they are queen to h1, queen to a8, queen to b8, and queen to c8. Those are hallway mates. And finally, there's queen to e7, which is a kiss of death. This is also a position that I think is really important to know. Just for efficiency's sake, it's good to know this position. There is actually a checkmate in 2 in this position. So even though it looks like the king can sort of run towards h1 and it might take 5 or 6 moves to get to mate, there's actually a way, if you're white to move, to deliver mate in 2 moves. See if you can find it. Okay, so this is a variation of the knight's move technique. And the idea is that rather than allowing black's king to run towards the h1 corner, we drive it closer to the white king so that it can more quickly assist in the checkmate. So the correct move is queen to g2. This is quite an elegant move. Black has only one possible square because all these squares are covered, as is this square. Black can only go king to h5. And now we have a variation of the hallway mate, and also we have a kiss of death. And the variation of the hallway mate is this move, queen to h3. And this time this is the only hallway mate because the kings aren't facing each other directly like this. The reason why this is still a mate in this position is because the queen covers this square and does the job that the king would be doing if it sat here. You'll notice that after king h5, this isn't checkmate because the king has g4 to escape to. The same is true of queen h2 check. It's just a check, it's not a mate, because again, the king can get out to g4. But if we go queen to h3, that's a mate. So this is a basic introduction to checkmating with king and queen versus king. To just recap, the 2 mates are the kiss of death and the hallway mate. Those are what you're aiming for. You can only do it with the opposing king on the edge of the board and with your king helping. The thing you want to avoid is stalemate, and you want to avoid pointless checks that don't do anything. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments, and I look forward to next time.